So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Toda, and since it is 1 o'clock Geneva time, I like to start the meeting, the Minamata Online Season 3 on ASGM and science. And before starting, I think I will provide you with some housekeeping notes. We are using this uh, uh, the WebEx platform, WebEx webinar. So the uh, participants are automatically muted, but so if you have any questions, please use the chat box. At the end of this session, there may be an opportunity for allowing oral questions, but I think we will first look at the chat box. Um, if there's any time for for oral interventions, please raise your hand, and then we will unmute you to speak. Please note that this session is recorded and broadcasted by YouTube. So I think Moses, I think you will be start recording. So it's recorded, I think. Thank you. So then I think I will switch to my the first screen. But um, so ladies and gentlemen, welcome from the Minamata Secretariat to this Minamata online session. How mercury science drives policy towards mercury-free ASGM. And uh, uh, we have invited experts from Duke University, Bill Pan and Alex Craft, and also from the University of Witwatersrand of South Africa, Ponto Tuara, and Gosha Stilo is from the United Nations Environment Program, and we are waiting for Dominic Bali, the African Center for Environmental Health, and he's a co-chair of the uh, open-ended scientific group for the effectiveness evaluation of the Minamata Convention. My name is Isak Toda. I'm in charge of the scientific and technical issues around in the Minamata Secretariat based in Geneva. So then I switch to my opening remark, and I think I will make this a full screen mode. And while doing this, I think I will need to look at whether the participant is, please hang on. Okay, so well, first I'd like to talk a little bit about the Minamata Online Season 3. Minamata Online is a series of online sessions convened by the Secretariat of the Minamata Convention, which consists of 3 streams. One is for the preparation for the conference of the parties. The second stream is implementation, review, and support. And third stream is Mercury Science. The Mercury Science stream is co-organized with the International Conference as Mercury as a Global Pollutant, ICMGP. The ICMGP 2022 which was held online this summer is working on 4 synthesis papers, and I will talk about this in the next slide. And we are planning a session on around these 4 topics. This is the first one. The first one being the ASGM science, and the next one is the first Wednesday of next month, December, on health risk communication. And then next year in March, we're going to have a session on mercury in southern hemisphere. And in April, we're going to have a session on mercury and climate change. So a little bit about ICMGP. The ICMGP is working on the four synthesis papers, which will be published in journal Ambio, uh, probably in February next year. And so the four topics are the first one, distribution of ASGM sources and emissions and impact in Africa. Second, global change in biochemical mercury cycling. The third one has risks, and fourth one, a synthesis of mercury research in the southern hemisphere. And the synthesis papers from ICMGP was published last time in 2018, and this there'll be a updated or with a new focus. ICMGP working on four synthesis papers, and please note that the ICMGP will meet in person uh, uh, in 2024 in Cape Town, as you see in the screen. Okay, so then as an introduction, I would like to just briefly talk about the Minamata Convention and the artisanal small-scale gold mining. The Minamata Convention is, of course, the global treaty that addresses the global mercury pollution, which entered into force in 2017. And the ASGM, artisanal small-scale gold mining, is the largest source of mercury emission and also the largest use of intentional use of mercury. So this is one of the largest focus of the Minamata Convention. Under the Minamata Convention Article 7, the parties that have uh, 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 significant or more than insignificant ASGM activities in their territory, it needs to develop and implement national action plans. And national action plans are required to include national objectives, actions to eliminate the worst practice, hollow amalgamation, and so on, and steps to facilitate the formalization or regulation of the ASGM sector, baseline estimates, strategies for reduction of emission releases of exposure to mercury, a public health strategy, and so on. So the policy or philosophy of the Minamata Convention on ASGM is that the uh, the parties take the responsibility to plan and implement actions and review as appropriate. And in the uh, convention, there are provisions on the support uh, to parties in addressing ASGM, such as the guidance document on national action plans, which was adopted at COP1 and updated at COP4, and other technical documents. There are other technical documents on the ASGM site monitoring, tailings management, and so on. And also WHO has worked on documents on public health strategies. Their supports through the Global Market Partnership convened by UNEP, and the Global Environmental Facility supports the development of national action plans, and it also has uh, uh, very large scale project called Planet Gold. And the chart you see on the right hand side of the screen is what is called the theory of change of the Planet Gold program, which uh, uh, identifies where we stand with the management of ASGM activities and what outcomes the project uh, aims to produce, and what impact the project aims to produce. And it clarifies what assumptions they have and what drivers there are to drive the situation around ASGM. So I think this kind of practice is very relevant in as you hear from the presentation from the experts. I think the key question is then how science can drive in planning and evaluation of these activities. Okay, so having said this, I would like to turn to Bill to speak about science gaps and opportunities. Bill, over to you.
Thanks, Yusaku. Do you want me to control the PowerPoint?
It's up to you. If you think it's easier, I
Yeah,
can.
it might be easier if I do it.
Okay, so I stopped sharing the screen, and you can share your screen.
Yeah. Right. You can see my screen, right?
Yes.
All right. All right. Thanks. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for the invitation. I want to make sure that people know that where I'm coming from with some of these comments. So I've been working in the Amazon primarily. I do have a project in Ghana in Western Africa, and that started before COVID and stalled because of COVID. But a lot of the comments that I'm going to be giving come from the collaborations I've been having with Alex Pfaff, who's going to be speaking after me, as well as Helen Sue Kim, who's at Duke, and the collaborators outside of Duke, like Adam Kiefer at Mercer University and Beth Feingold at SUNY Albany, and our collaborators in Peru at Cayetano Heredia, like Jaime Miranda. So a lot of those things come from our work that's being done in the Amazon, in Peru, Ecuador, and Guyana primarily. But just wanted to make sure I make that one caveat. So I'm going to very briefly talk about four main areas, and I'm really going to focus on the first one that's listed here, biomonitoring and biomarkers, because I really believe that the key area where we have gaps and opportunities for doing more research, but also to drive some of the policy that is being conducted. I'm going to be talking about exposure to impacts, medical science, and emerging toxicology, as well as the lack of health integrated research, which will segue into some of the comments that Alex is going to be making. So for biomarkers and biomonitoring, I want to specify that what I'm talking about here is not just a biomarker to detect exposure to mercury, which is typically what most people think about when we think about a biomarker. So in the Minamata guidance, we three biomarkers and blood biomarkers that indicate exposure to different types of mercury. But I'm also going to be
Bill, you got frozen, I think.
to that level. So the first big limitation is the window of exposure that some of the biomarkers that we commonly think about and how they're used. So for example, urine and blood, when they're used, that's only a short time of exposure that gives us an idea of what a person is exposed to. And when I mean short time, I mean roughly a couple of days to maybe a week, maybe 10 days at most. And so that window of exposure is actually quite short. When we talk about hair, hair is usually characterized as chronic, a measure of chronic mercury exposure. And that's because 1 centimeter of your hair is roughly 1 month of exposure. But even that is relatively limited when we talk about trying to associate an exposure to a health effect, because the health effect that is observed can often be several months, if not years, after that level of exposure. So we need to work on thinking about different ways of how those windows work. Malnutrition is also a big one. So in most research that is conducted on the effects of mercury exposure, they're not conducted in ASGM environments. They're conducted in relatively wealthy, um, high income or upper middle income countries where there really isn't any kind of competing health problems that we're thinking about when mercury is when a person is exposed to mercury. The most important one is malnutrition. So anything from anemia to stunting to wasting, those types of problems that people experience, both children and adults, can augment and increase the effects of mercury, making you more susceptible to a low dose of an exposure. And we just do not have a strong evidence base yet to really state strongly how malnutrition influences health outcomes. Another one that has come up recently is the lack of biomarkers for people that have impaired mercury clearance. This is a relatively small percentage of the population, but basically what happens is that there is a small percentage of the population that do not um, clear mercury from their system as an average person would. So the typical biomarkers we use, like urine, blood, and hair, don't actually work for those people, even if they are exposed to high levels of mercury. So we need to think about how those types of biomarkers can be developed. So some of the opportunities here, I mean, the main one are these things called biologically effective doses, these kind of biomarkers that try to understand how how there's this interaction between the exposure and macromolecules like proteins and DNA. So thinking specifically about genetic polymorphisms like these SNPs that could make somebody more susceptible, or even epigenetics, which epigenetics is still an emerging area of science, and it has a lot of different applications to measuring internal dose or effect or susceptibility. We're just not, I would say, we're not there as a scientific community yet to really use epigenetics yet in policy or recommend things on how to inform clinicians. In terms of biomonitoring, I think the main thing here, especially as it relates to ASGM environments, is that we do not do a great job of distinguishing vulnerable populations. It's not straightforward. So the Minamata guidance, which is that graph that you see on the right, generally separates an ASGM community from, say, fish consumers, indigenous, and other types of groups. Um, but in reality, what actually happens is you get a lot of overlapping communities that are both ASGM and fish consumers, or indigenous and involved in the ASGM environment. So you can't easily distinguish to say what biomarker should we be using to actually monitor a particular population. And then you have to think about how is the mercury exposure actually occurring in those particular communities, because that will affect the decision of how you actually conduct that biomonitoring. And what I mean there is, obviously, if you study mercury, you already know, but if your source of exposure is primarily dietary, which is probably a methylmercury exposure through fish, you want to be monitoring those populations with hair. If it's through some kind of inhalation effect, most likely that's an inorganic exposure and you want to be looking at urine. Blood is always a good one to use that looks at both inorganic and organic sources, but the problem is that that tends to be a little bit more invasive. Um, so what I would say the opportunities here are not just recommend the biomarkers to be applied to different communities, but really understand mercury ecology. And what I mean there is I'm drawing upon, say, a disease ecology approach to say, can we understand the social, economic, and environmental factors that are influencing how mercury is causing exposure in communities, and then use that information to optimize how we are doing biomonitoring and selecting biomarkers. The rest of these comments are going to be relatively fast. So linking exposure to health impacts. So this is a direct continuation of the last slide, but really focusing on the fact that the window of exposure is not equal to the timing of a clinical outcome. And this can be seen everything from the in utero research that we have seen in publications where you're looking at pregnant women's exposure to mercury and neurocognitive impairment at age 5, or early life exposure to mercury and something like kidney disease or hypertension as a young adult or in their 40s and 50s. So some of the opportunities here, there's obviously some more epigenetic work that can be done to try to understand how to monitor impairments, or even isotope tracing to try to link specific types of mercury exposure to uh, different clinical outcomes that you see. But I would say that one of the big easy ones that we can do is invest in longitudinal studies or longitudinal monitoring of interventions so that we can understand how over a long period of time, mercury is influencing people's health. And this can be directly integrated into policy or intervention monitoring. And we have one of the first birth cohorts in a mining environment in Peru, which we call CONAMOD. And Beth Feingold and I are right now working on the follow-up of those kids who are turning about age 4 and 5. And then there's a disconnect. And this is one I put in there. Maybe it's not relevant for driving the policy, but we need to bring clinicians more into the fold in a greater rate that we currently have. Clinicians have a lot of influence in the health communities as well as other communities. But the problem is that if you go into any medical school, they do not have courses in toxicology and environmental health. So they don't have the tools and the knowledge to properly study or even clinically treat patients who are exposed to mercury. And some opportunities here, NIEHS from the US, for example, has joint training programs. We at Duke have something called ITEP, the Integrated Toxicology and Environmental Health Program, which is the medical school and School of Environment to train PhD and medical students in toxicology. But these are extremely rare, and they have to increase in their presence. And then just to sum up, this is my last slide, the lack of integrated research. And I think this is really where the impact for mercury and health, mercury interventions and policy can take advantage of some of the health research. We have an overabundance of cross-sectional research, but we don't really have integrated interventions or integrated monitoring and evaluation. So what that means is if we are doing a study on, say, a new technology for miners to adopt, we don't have an integrated assessment of what are the health impacts of those interventions. How does health even modify a behavioral choice? And these things can be directly implemented or integrated into these types of interventions and evaluations. We need to invest in building a stronger evidence base, and in order to do that, we need to have a more holistic approach. So I think Alex is going to pick it up from here on some of the work that we've been doing, but I'm open for questions, and thanks for the time.
Thank you, Bill. And perhaps we will have a question and answer session after the four presentations. So I think we will move directly to Alex. But before doing that, yeah, I think I have to. I forgot to mention how we plan this work this event, and I mentioned the synthesis paper that will be presented by Ponto. Oh, but at the same time, there were a series, several workshops on related to ASGM. One workshop, or it was joint workshop, uh, uh, convened by the Duke University group, the Bill and Alex, and the other one was by Dr. Marcelo Vega, and we planned this event with these experts, and very unfortunately this time slot didn't work for Marcelo, but we received his message that he would concur with the what Alex would present. So perhaps I think you will represent the key researchers in the ASGM field. So Alex, over to you.
Thank you, Isaac. Thanks, everybody. And I will, as you'll see, try to. I'm going to share. There you, are you seeing my
yes
slides?
Yes, I see.
Okay.
Yes,
I will. Sorry, I got to move this little talking thing. It's kind of in the way. Okay. All right. Thank you. I will try to represent. I emailed with Marcelo about trying to summarize some of the things he said at ICMGP. So as Bill so nicely set up, I'll be trying to represent both sort of our general perspective on evidence as you set up in the agenda, Isaku, as evidence on ASGM interventions, and sort of a little bit on things that Duke Mercer, and that's with Adam Kiefer, Bill and I, and students and partners, what we're trying to do for evidence. And the basic goal, let me just get this. Okay, there we go. Is we're trying to increase impact evaluation. Oh, there we go, it's going crazy. And roughly, just we think that for all the things that have been set out, there have been pretty low requirements for evidence. We haven't asked people to please be sure to convince yourselves first, of course, and convince the beneficiaries, most important, but also just convince the world so the world can learn, what happened. Can you please provide evidence? And of course, if we're going to ask people to do things, we might need to support it financially. So we haven't required evidence and we haven't supported investments in evidence. But if we do, we actually think that can help increase more realistic plans. If you, even just before a project, asking and requiring a demonstration of not only a theory of change, but a feasible, practical, believable plan for how will you show impact, I think is an important pre-project question. Wow, and this, my computer's going crazy. And then ongoing tracking of what is actually happening, as Bill just laid out, is critical as you go, because there's all sorts of good ideas, but they don't always work, of course. And so the sooner we can find out what's working or not, the better. We can use global resources better. Okay, so in here I'm trying to do a quick summary of some things Marcelo said at ICMGP with his permission. He used a nice categorizations of, there's been a bunch of natural science interventions. You can develop new technologies. You can track through the landscape mercury flows, and Bill referred to some of that. And then you can track also the health consequences, again, as Bill was talking about. And those are all, really serious areas of applied science, all of which are very helpful and relevant here. And then on the social science side, you can imagine trying different legal and formalization options. Sometimes there's rights, sometimes there's like rights that you earn if you're formalized. Sometimes there's restrictions that you lose if you're not formalized. There's various efforts to expand and include, trying to reach out to get the poorest miners. Sometimes we see interventions that you can imagine working for some folks who already have assets, but it's kind of hard to imagine working for the majority of small miners who don't have assets. And then you can imagine interventions in supply chains, trying to raise prices as a function of changed practices. And people talk about those a fair bit. And so Marcelo, I think it's fair to say, suggested in his prior talk that in his decades of experience on the ground, which you have to respect, he has seen little impact from most of this. And I think he also said, what he saw most hope for was, coexistence. I'm not sure everyone thinks that word means the same thing, but something about smaller miners working with folks with larger capital, maybe actually larger companies, but sort of small working with big. In a way, what I would say as an economist, sort of substituting capital for mercury in terms of processing ore, maybe has hope, and we'll say more about that. So there's sort of a good motivation if folks who are looking on the ground for decades think little impact has happened. There's a lot of motivation for trying to track what is actually happening. And there's a lot we could track, as Bill has just suggested. We could track technology adoption, mercury flows, health outcomes, law adoption, income earnings for populations. We could track all those things, given all those potential theories of change, but we actually don't track it. So we're not sure what's going on out there, as best I can tell after decades. I think there are, of course, experts who know a lot, much more than I do, but not a lot of demonstration with evidence that we can carry out to the literature. It doesn't even seem like we're sort of asking people to be accountable for impacts. The theories of change vary quite a bit. What Isaku just showed, if you look at I was trying to look at a very small print quickly, but it looked like the action plan was enhance adoption. Well, so that's a good goal. It's not exactly a plan to make it happen. And they're nowhere near what I would call, a randomized controlled trial pre-analysis plan, like you have to file now if you want to have, an intervention with the World Bank, say. And afterwards, there's amazingly few details required on what actually changed or not. Forget getting to mechanisms. Why did they change or not? Which would help other people learn how they could do the same or better. Obviously, we all trying sensible things, but we want to build on past experiences so the next investment is smarter. And we can do that. We can ask these evaluation questions. That leads to more measurements. That leads to better plans. So roughly, we're looking around. We'd love to build on the shoulders of experts, and we're having trouble figuring out what happened in the last few decades. So generically, what kind of data are we talking about? Who changed what behavior? And changed meaning before versus after some intervention. So which set of actors did it? Which behavior? And then pretty importantly, what population were they drawn from? Who could have changed behavior and did or didn't? Those are really useful things to know. If they did change behavior, would they have changed behavior anyway without the intervention? That's super important. So lots of factors, gold prices, elections, clearly affect mining behaviors. And those can change while a project's going on. So we need to try to track what are the effects of these other factors. And sometimes one way to do that is to look what happened with similar people who did not receive an intervention or controls. So did the people who did not receive the intervention also change behavior? Well, if they did, then maybe the intervention didn't do anything. And who are the people who we intervened with like? Are there a lot of people like them? First of all, can we find similar people so that we have good control, so we can argue that we have valid evidence of impact? That's a really big focus in impact evaluation. And second, what about scaling up? Because probably we don't really want our small demonstration interventions to be all we do. We want them to be a way to say, oh, great, that's a good thing. We can scale that up and make it 100 times bigger because it's such a good idea and we have evidence. Well, that might depend on if we have 100 times as many similar people or not. So this information on the population seems really important. Who could scale up if this thing works? And again, they've all been sensible ideas. Many experts come before this PowerPoint presentation. So I'll say just a tiny bit. I'll say that our Duke Mercer group is working in Guyana with CI, who's been delightful. And Adam already had a lot of experience there and working with them. Talking with Alliance for Responsible Mining about a number of things, but with some focus in Peru, both in past data, because they do collect a lot of nice data, say thinking about Craft and Fairmind, and maybe going forward, building on, potentially I think building on some of the things that Bill just mentioned, his expertise in Peru on health measures. And then Ecuador, working with UNDP Ecuador, who've just been amazingly open to work with us. I mean, literally yesterday I had an email from a guy on vacation trying to help our young guy in the field get paid. So just kudos to them and thanks for cooperation on trying to generate some evidence. So what are we doing in Ecuador? Their plan, already in place when we arrived on the scene, was to invest in processing plants, to offer new options to small miners, again, to use the processing plants instead of mercury, capital for instead of mercury in my economics language, in order to maybe increase the income of the miners and reduce the use of mercury. The data collection plans, not shockingly, are pretty much designed to meet the project documents. And we actually think it's possible to meet those project document indicators even if mercury use doesn't change. So just to give an example of how that might, I'll do that in the next slide, actually, sorry. The ongoing field work is looking for populations, as we just mentioned, where in particular they're now focused on women miners, which is super interesting. There's different populations and subpopulations. And what do we want to know? How many are there? And do we expect them to actually gain from these plans? And ongoing field work now, the one I just referred to with some students, is helping us learn about that. We are actually trying to ask them also what preferences they have over interventions, what they think could help them better. We figure folks on the ground are knowledgeable about themselves. And then we want to, again, try to collect before and after information, like what processing method were they using? What income did they have before? And then what processing method, what income do they have after? Sometimes it's what information do they have? Are you aware that there's toxicity of mercury? Are you aware that there's an option that the UNDP is offering you? And then there's trust. Do you trust different actors who you might have to be involved with if you're going to formalize and change your behavior? So those are the kind of things we're trying to talk to them about in Ecuador for women miners who've been offered options from UNDP. And then the questions are, given the shifts or not in behavior, was mercury lowered? We're not up to that yet. Did anybody who shifted actually earn more money? Did everyone who shifted earn more money? And do we expect that we can scale it? Those are the motivations for the survey we now have in the field, literally okay. Just to step back then, for the perfect, call it Vega coexistence plan, And again, that for us generally means thinking about using higher capital plants in place of mercury. Why would you want to collect all that data? I mean, isn't it obvious that things will work? And I'm setting up the answer, no, it's not. Let's imagine that the indicator in a project document is reduce mercury use by X. And you do it a la coexistence because small producers bring ore to plants. And X is usually measured how? I think it's usually measured, you measure the gold that was produced and you multiply by a mercury gold ratio. That's how I think it's usually done. So let's imagine we have a positive number. We had some gold and we multiplied by a ratio. Did we really lower mercury, or is it possible that we didn't? So a question that we have is, what if the plant hadn't been there that you invested in? What would they have done with their ore? Well, if you don't know that, you don't know if you had impact, because maybe the ore could have just gone to another plant. There's other plants out there. For sure, there's other plants out there. They're already buying the ore, say in Ecuador. What would the plant have done if those miners hadn't brought that mercury? We don't know that. We don't know if there's impact. Because if the plant would have just used its capacity for some other miner, then the project didn't make a difference. You just shifted one small miner at the plant for another small miner at the plant, and net impact was zero. That could happen. Who knew about this option but didn't take it up? Who didn't know about the option but would take it up if they had known? We don't tend to know that, and it's really helpful for thinking about scaling. And who brought the ore to the gold and why? And what did they gain? Again, we might not know that, but knowing whether they really raised their incomes or they didn't is probably important for thinking about whether we want to scale up. So those are the kinds of questions, not at all substituting for the good basic ideas, but complementing the good basic ideas so we can see which ones really worked best in which conditions to give advice going forward. So, and that's not just us, we think everybody could do this. So it's been hard to learn from previous efforts for us. We know there are experts, far more expert than us, but we'd love to know really what happened with all those projects. Did the projects not have data? How do we fix it? We require project evaluations. We require data, and we support it with money. The lack of agreed metrics, this follows a little bit from some things in health that Bill has mentioned over time, can also be an issue. We've had various suggestions. There's a nice paper. Could we have universal metrics? Should we? There are some. If we think about Minamata, say, effectiveness evaluation, I don't think they're actually being widely applied at the project level, though. And it would be really nice to connect from the country level, such as NAPS and these evaluations, to the project level, which is where many interventions occur. It's not clear there's a lot of investment in long-run study. Journals ask for it or you can't publish, but we could also induce it with requirements and funding for evidence, we believe. So we think sharing rigorous evidence is a great basis for progress, but you got to collect it. So we would love to support it. We hope a lot of other people do it. We'd love to share stories with others. And I don't know how long I've gone. I hope not too long. Thank you. Share.
Thank you. Thank you, Alex, for your wonderful presentation, and your questions are very, very good ones, very difficult ones. As we are working on the effectiveness evaluation, you mentioned the effectiveness evaluation questions, but these the baseline or business as usual is things are very difficult to take into account. So and also I like to note that the Jeff recently, I think it was last year, published a Jeff Evaluation Office did an evaluation of the ASGM portfolio, and the key, one of the key recommendations is that the Planet Gold and other projects need to be evaluated really in terms of the expected outcome and impact, but perhaps we uh, uh, with the broad participation of experts, we would really improve the planning and evaluation of projects. So thank you very much. So first, then I would like to uh, uh, turn to the next series of presentation, which are about the synthesis papers from the ICMGP, and My understanding is that Ponto is going to have a general introduction or overview of the synthesis paper, and Gosha is talking to some numbers from these data numbers from these studies. So, Ponto, over to you. And perhaps I think I will share my screen because I think it was.
Okay. Can I try to share on my side?
Yes, please. If you prefer,
See if I'm able to. Okay, share.
I think you're sharing my. Okay, good.
Okay, are you able to see the presentation?
Yes, yes. We now see it very nicely.
Okay, thank you very much, Isaku, and thank you for the invitation. So I've been tasked with giving a summary of the synthesis paper that we did looking at mercury use in ASGM with a focus on data collection and mercury-free technologies. Now, as we know, artisanal and small-scale mining activities have been increasing globally. At one point, we're talking about 13 million people, 20 to 30 million people, and currently we're talking about more than 40 million people that are working in the sector. And a significant percentage of the workforce is in ASGM, which accounts about 34% of the workforce, which is about 15 million. And we know that a significant number of the workforce is women and children. And while the growth of ASM and ASGM, to be specific, marks the importance of the sector, particularly in providing livelihoods, it's also a concern in that majority of the activities use mercury. And knowing the impacts of mercury exposure and mercury pollution, as stakeholders, there's been a number of efforts that have been implemented to reduce and eliminate mercury use in ASGM. Now, against this background, the synthesis paper had two components. The first component was on data collection with the aim of contributing towards refining estimates, the data that we have on ASGM, mercury, and mercury use. And the other component was to look at mercury-free technologies with a view of wanting to establish the landscape of alternative technologies that we have, how do they work, and also to understand some of the key challenges that are influencing adoption of the technologies in the sector. So from these two objectives, the synthesis paper covered four components. The first component looking at global baseline on mercury, review of mercury-free technologies. The synthesis paper also looked at some of the testing and demonstration efforts that we've seen in the sector and zoomed into socioeconomic considerations of technology adoption. Now, on the first component, which looked at global baseline of mercury use in ASGM. We know that one of the challenges affecting data collection in the sector is informality. And as such, the information that we use, or the information that we have on the sector, be it on the number of people in the sector or on mercury and other areas, is extracted from a broad range of sources. And while we have estimates to work with, one of the challenges or gaps that needs to be addressed is the disparities within the data, because you find that one source would say this is the gold produced in the sector, and another source would say having differences in the estimates that they provide. So there's typically an error range of between 30 and 100%. Another issue relating to the data in the sector is that when you go to some of the countries, there's lack of up-to-date data. And based on these issues, there's a need to ascertain or determine the real quantities of mercury use in the ASGM sector, because this is a critical input into formalization and initiatives that are needed in the sector. So based on this gap, the premise of this component of the paper was using the data collected from national action plans from NAP to address these data gaps, because NAPs, provide or the requirement in putting together NAPs is good understanding of the ASGM sector and practices. The next presentation will provide insights into the data that has been collected through NAPs. The second component of the synthesis paper looked at review of mercury-free technologies. And this was tied to concerns that if you look at the trajectory of the ASM sector and ASGM sector, it dates back to the 1980s, 1990s. And as I said, we've seen increasing development efforts in the sector, particularly aimed at providing alternatives or replacing mercury amalgamation. And the concern when you look at level of adoption and the use of these technologies is actually low. And it's a question of why. Why is the miners not using mercury-free technologies? Because they are there and they are being introduced in the sector. So the focus of the second component was understanding the landscape of mercury-free technologies, providing, or getting clarity on the various technologies and assessing the suitability of these technologies within an ASGM environment. And by so doing, identify the technical shortcomings that needs to be improved, that needs to be addressed in order to improve the level of adoption. So part of the work that we did was first answering the question. So the study was mostly a desktop research, and part of the work was first asking the question, what constitute suitability? And that reverted us to looking at why mercury remains attractive in the ASGM sector. So from understanding that, it's important that mercury-free technologies, need to be able to integrate all these aspects. And some of these aspects speaks to the need to be able to recover gold from different types of ores, that technologies need to be suitable for small and large batches of ore, given the spectrum of ASGM activities that are there. They need to offer high gold recoveries in less time in order to be able to compete with mercury amalgamation process. The importance of incorporating local needs and capacities, aspects on simplicity, ease of use, affordability were found to also influence adoption, and also considering of availability of these technologies, the inputs, and also, other aspects, your social, economic, cultural issues needs to also be considered. So from understanding all these factors, the assessment that we did focused on 5 aspects: properties of the ore, operational requirements, workflow and performance, local tech considerations, as well as health, safety, and the environment. So these are just some insights on the information that you'll find in the synthesis paper around ore properties. So technologies that we reviewed can work with different types of ore, but mostly free milling ores. A few can work with refractory ores. Some of the technologies require high-grade ore, and most of them are designed for small batches, even though some have, models that can take up large batches. And also there's an option of, working with multiple, technologies or equipment. Under operational requirements, finding was the cost and operational environments differ, with costs ranging between 40 USD for simple sloughs to 45,000 for an integrated plant. And also key when looking at operational requirements, you need to consider inputs, utilities such as electricity and water. And one of the aspects was that some of these technologies require clean water, which is an issue. In terms of workflow and performance, one of the advantages of mercury-free technologies is that they offer high recoveries compared to the amalgamation process, and they can recover other minerals within the ore. However, because they're not standalone, they have to work with other equipment both upstream and downstream. The workflow is complicated. And as I mentioned, it's important to consider local, considerations, supplies, inputs, and adaptability. And those were some of the gaps that we noted in assessing the technologies. And a key benefit of mercury-free technologies is low health, safety, and environmental risk. However, the issues around consumption of water needs to be looked at. The conclusion coming from this component is that there are clear benefits that mercury-free technologies offer, particularly in terms of the recovery of gold. However, there are areas that needs to be improved for the technologies to compete with mercury. And just on the data side, while there is, growing, body of work or, work around mercury-free technologies, we found that there's actually limited technical data on the individual technologies. And one of the data gaps is mineralogical characteristics of the ore that, can be used by the various technologies. And also, while there's mention of the technologies being tested, the technologies being demonstrated, we found that there was actually lack of evidence or results coming from these this field demonstrations. And the outcome of in having identified all these gaps, and outcome of this assessment is actually a digital atlas that we developed to build and store information on mercury-free technologies. Moving to the third component of the synthesis paper, which looked at global efforts on mercury reduction. And objective was to draw lessons and experiences from technology transfer interventions to understand the challenges of adoption. And some of the issues that were identified through the study was that technical aspects is an issue. You'd find that with technology transfer initiatives, when technologies are being piloted, it's through an approach of one size fits all. They can process all types of ores, which is not the case. Another gap that was identified was with the mature technologies, and these are technologies that have been trialed and tested and are used in large-scale mining operations. You'd find that they are poorly optimized and are not adapted to ASGM environments. Another aspect that came out from the study was the level of organization as a factor of adoption. So it was highlighted that there's often a mismatch between the operational requirements and the needs and capacity of the miners, that you find that with some technologies, there's a need for large feed, and considering that within a specific location, it will mostly be artisanal miners that don't produce as much, and that becomes an issue. The other aspect that is noted is technology is not going through the whole process of technology development. You'd find that particularly with emerging technologies, they are tested in labs and piloted in few sites, and they'll be promoted and commercialized without evidence of field efficacy. There's also a note on responsiveness and the needs of the miners, that some of these initiatives are just fix and go initiatives and don't take into account the need for capacity building. The other aspect talks to ASGM supply chain and influence of your middleman influences of mercury traders in adoption of technology. So key to this, which were also highlighted by Alex, is income generated from the use of alternative technology is important. The need for capacity building is also important, and when developing technology, shouldn't only be about the miners that will be using the technology, but we also need to look at the whole ASGM value chain and include other actors in interventions that are put forward, and also the importance of understanding local context and needs. And that brought us to the last component of the synthesis paper, looking at socioeconomic considerations. And these are findings from work done in Uganda. And some of the social factors that need to be taken into account or that affect technology adoption, speaks to miners not being aware of the health impacts of mercury. There's still low levels of awareness as far as knowing that there's actually alternative technologies that they can use. Mobility of the miners and lack of security of tenure makes ownership of technologies difficult, because you'd find that in some of the sites they will be evicted. So having technology makes it difficult. And there's also other aspects that are not ideal, particularly for women who need a process that will enable them to recover gold quickly, to do other chores after working. In terms of the economic factors, it's issues around costs, ability to secure funding, spoken about the influence of middlemen, and more importantly, what are the incentives of using mercury-free technologies, where at the end the gold is sold at the same price. They've also highlighted, lack of public utilities, services, particularly water and electricity, to support technology adoption in ASGM. And so what's coming out of the paper is that it's important for technology development and implementation to be informed by technical, social, and economic factors that make mercury attractive, because it will always boil down to the question, what benefits do these technologies offer against mercury? And it's important that this work is backed by evidence, understanding the sector, understanding or having evidence-based data on mercury use and mercury-free technologies. In terms of the work that we are doing, continuing from our contribution to the synthesis paper is on the digital atlas. However, a key challenge that we are facing is both in terms of the data, that is, there's limitations in terms of the data, and also the credibility of the data. And without data on the various technologies, the digital platform that we're creating is not going to be useful to the sector. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ponto. So we very much look forward to the synthesis paper that was published in February in Ambio. So, and sorry for being a bit bad at keeping the time, but we should have I should have said that this presentation time is 10 minutes for each, and the last speaker is Gosia, and I already asked her to make it as brief as possible to have a discussion time. So Gosia.
Thank you very much, Isako. And would you screen the slides?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, everybody. I'd like to tell you now a little bit more about the data. Give you example of one of the most recent data sets on mercury use and ASGM sector in general. And keeping in mind actually all the uncertainties and challenges of collecting data and measuring impact in the sector that the previous presenter have outlined, we're going to give you this example from the National Action Plan. So just to come into one of the data source, so Global Mercury Assessment from 2018 states that total annual mercury use in ASGM was estimated to be over 2,000 tons per year. And as you might be aware, ASGM is the largest source of mercury emission to air, anthropogenic emission to air. And now, next slide, please. Now, coming to the data sets from the national action plans, which Isaac already mentions, are obligation for each country that determines that ASGM in its territory is more than insignificant. Next slide, please. So looking globally, there are 46 countries that have been undertaking the project to develop national action plan for the ASGM sector. Out of those 46, 22 have finalized their NAP. They are marked in blue on the map. Next time, please. So in order to really develop a national strategies to transform sector, ASGM sector, each NAP requires a good understanding of the sector. And in order to do this, the countries are developing a national overview of the sector. This includes data collection through literature review, through consultation with stakeholders, through field visit, and trying to gather information on mercury use, practices employed at the ASGM site, and various health, socioeconomic, and policy aspects of the sector. So to understand actually the data that has been collected through the National Action Plan projects, we have extracted the data from the finalized NAP, so the 22 countries that we have seen previously on the map. We have looked through the national overview and targets and strategies part of the National Action Plan document, and we have extracted various quantitative information, such as estimated mercury use, estimated gold production, estimated number of miners, presence of worst practices. We have also looked and gathered a summary of key narrative information, such as role of women, of children, tailing management, legal status, key location of ASGM, etc. We also extracted mercury reduction and elimination targets as reported by each country in their NAP document, and summarized required strategy that the country plan to implement. Next slide, please. So now I would like to just quickly give you an overview of 3 examples of the data that has been collected in the NAPs. So we see here mercury use estimates as presented by the 22 final NAPs. So we see in the purple bar tons of mercury. I realize there is actually no explanation in the x-axis. So there are tons of mercury use, estimated tons of mercury use per year. In purple bar, we see the estimates derived from the National Action Plan document, versus in gray for each country, the dark gray, we can see the estimate provided by the Global Mercury Assessment 2018. And as we notice immediately that this data varies. For some of the countries, the mercury use estimate in the NAPs are much higher than the previously reported in the global mercury assessments. For the other countries, other way around. This change might not really imply that the change in mercury use over time. It might simply show the difference in data collection or availability of new data. For most of the cases, the National Action Plan data is the most recent data. The first NAP was submitted in 2018 with many projects still ongoing. And just to give you example, for example, in Madagascar, we have seen through the information that the NAP collected that there is a high number of mercury-intensive small-scale dredging operation were documented, and that really pushed, the mercury estimate to be higher under NAP versus the previous reported. Versus in Ecuador, for example, the NAP reported that only around 40% of ASGM gold is produced with mercury, which we see here also the reported mercury use for Ecuador are lower than previously reported. Next slide, please. A second example is occurrence of the worst practices. As we know, these are the 4 practices that the convention aims to eliminate, and based on 22 countries, we see that the most common worst practice is open burning of amalgam, which of course expose miners and their community to the adverse effects of mercury. We see also burning of amalgam in residential areas, and cyanide use with mercury-containing tailing is of high importance. This practice in many countries. The whole organization was the least common worst practice as documented by the countries in their NAPs. And the last example is about mercury reduction targets. So here again, we can see on the left side, we see a cumulative estimated mercury use by 22 countries that finalized their NAP. These estimates from those 22 countries as of 2021 sum up to over 360 tons of mercury. If the countries are going to implement the strategies that they outlined in their NAP, they aim to reduce around 37% of that baseline amount by 2025, and around 70%, almost 250 tons of that baseline amount by 2030. Next slide, please. And just to give you a little bit, a bigger picture, what we can see here are top 10 countries with most mercury intensive ASGM based on global mercury assessment. And these 10 countries actually sum up to almost 1,500 tons of mercury use per year, which is around 70% of the global estimate of mercury use in SGM sector. And from those 10 countries, if we look now which one have already completed their NAP or what is the status of NAP project, we see that only Ecuador for now have finalized their national action plans. The Indonesia, Peru, Bolivia, and Brazil, the efforts are ongoing to develop NAP, and for rest 5 countries, there is no project so far. So I think I'm going to slowly close up also for the sake of the time, but just wanted to highlight again that this was example of data, of numbers that we can characterize ASGM sector. However, there are of course linked uncertainties with this data and how they were collected. And one of the most important lessons analyzing the data from the NAP is that it's very important to link the qualitative data that I've just presented with the narrative information. The NAP provides many qualitative information that gives you a bigger overview and better understanding also what is behind those numbers, and what types of uncertainties are linked, what knowledge gaps are there. And this would enable us really better to also use this data in later measuring progress and for shaping policy and implementation. Yeah, thank you very much. And I have on my last slide, I have left links to the website where we have published a full database with the data extracted from NAPS. I'm going to post this maybe also in chat here, or if anybody's interested. And yeah, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Gosia. Wonderful. And your last slides about the emission reminded about the work of the IPCC on emission inventory and monitoring, and then it translates into the UNFCCC, the nationally determined commitments, and so on and so forth. So there's an place for science and Dominic Bali, who is co-chair of the scientific open-ended work scientific group for the effectiveness evaluation of the Minamata Convention, is daily struggling the issue of what science can say about the Minamata Convention. So to start the discussion session, I will review look at the questions in the chat. But before doing that, I would invite Dominic to provide your thoughts, or if you have any provoking questions to the panelists, please.
Thank you so much, Isaku, and thank you to you all for the presentation that have been made. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are. And based on what you all presented today, I'm happy that you presented, you highlighted the effectiveness evaluation questions, because this is where we are going now. But to arrive at where we want to go, there is one burning policy question that we have to answer. And that question is about how the change resulting from the interventions in levels of mercury in the environment have made the biotic media and vulnerable population could be attributed to the Minamata Convention. And that question we are trying to answer to this question, especially coming from the ASGM sectors. And I'm happy that Gosha mentioned about the question of uncertainties and even the discrepancies that we are identifying in the data collection, because data is a key information essentially for the effectiveness evaluation. We see the big gaps that we have between the global mercury assessment that has been performed in 2018 and even the NAPS results. This gap would be attributed to the method that have been used for each assessment, for example, because the NAP methodology is different from the MIA methodology, which is quite different from, again, the GMA's methodology. However, there are some points where we could try to harmonize some methodologies and see how this data will be managed later. And some points that have been mentioned also will be subject to discussion later, because coming back to what Bill was saying initially, when we are in a scheme of co-exposure, for example, or multi-exposure windows, how can we say that all the signs that the clinical signs that we are identifying in miners or even the communities are attributed to mercury, and mercury resulting from ASGM sector? This is one point we need also to discuss later. And even when we have to discuss about the vulnerable groups which are impacted by mercury, can we say that it's just the minor community, the miners communities? Can we say that it's just people living in ASGM areas, or at the end, is the whole country population a vulnerable population from mercury? This is some point we need to discuss again. And even the case of itinerant mining is something to be addressed in Africa region, for example, and that's lead us to what Pancho was saying, because when we have the informality, the informality in mining, where we identify miners group in one point today, and tomorrow they are no more in that place and they are moving to another one, generating new emissions. At the end, how can we count all these emissions resulting from the different activities? So these are so many challenges that we need to discuss and to see how science can better address this kind of question and later propose an effective, efficient evaluation plan for the different countries. And I will just come back conclude my word by about the one point raised by Alex on behalf of Marcello. In the case of coexistence of miners, coexistence between small-scale miners and large-scale miners, how are we going to build the trust between these two entities when you see that even when artisanal miners are processing, there is no trust among themselves, essentially, on to see how much gold is produced from the minerals, from the deposit. Now, when they have to send their ore to the large-scale mine for treatment, how are we going to build that trust, to later see that we have been able to reduce mercury from X amount because it has been processed without mercury by the large-scale mines? These are some key questions that we need to see, and for later identify how much the indicators that are presented to see how much mercury has been reduced in the environment, and also how much miners could work and reduce mercury even if they are trained by the large-scale mines. I'll stop there for now, and we'll let the participant raise additional question, and I'm happy to answer if I am asked to do that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dominic. I think that's a very interesting question. Not only your first question is not only to Gosia, but I would be interested in what all the panelists would say about the question on data. Of course, Gosia can just respond about the data on the baseline estimates and so forth. But Bill could say something about the biomonitoring and so on and so forth. So I would invite Gosha, Bill, Alex, and Ponto to respond all this question, and perhaps Bill and Alex received a specific question about the coexisting and biomonitoring. So perhaps the first round will be in this order. Gosia.
Thank you very much. So again, we are talking about data and uncertainties linked to data, right, Dominic? Just to confirm.
Yes, yes.
So this is what I was trying to when I was closing my presentation, saying that it's nice to show the numbers because this can be very powerful, right? If you just see this is amount of mercury and maybe this change or not over years. We have to be very careful as there's different methodologies, as you were discussing already, Dominic, as well. And how do we compare different data sets? And I guess for the long term, it might be difficult to compare different data sets. So if we could try to have some common methodology, obviously it has to be flexible methodology, since ASGM sector is also very complex and different in different countries. It has to be a common methodology, but flexible, so it's able to be adjusted to the national or local circumstances. If we could try to see a trend over with some similar methodology, I think that would be very helpful over the time. For example, that could be possible through the review of the national action plans. The data that I was showing is supposed to be the baseline for the country, and there is always date linked to this baseline data that the country went to the field, collected the data. If they could repeat the exercise in few years, maybe we could have better information if they use the same methodology, of course. But nevertheless, again, I just wanted to highlight again that the data that is presented by country is very important, but it's also important to see what was not possible to collect. And most of the National Action Plan also discuss a lot of the knowledge gaps and provides recommendation for later on to improve the data quality and data collection and the understanding of the ASGM sector. So I think this all narrative information that are a part of the National Action Plan documents are very important and has to be taken really into consideration.
Thank you. Thank you, Gosia. If I may propose, I would invite the Bill and Alex and Ponto to limit your response to 1 minute, if possible. So,
Okay.
Bill.
So on our
So,
side,
okay,
I
one point.
managed.
Okay, yeah,
Yeah, so
go ahead.
I mentioned the credibility of the data because essentially, particularly in terms of information that we've collected and are putting out there on the various technologies, it's what we've been able to collect from various sources, and a key gap, and it's always a question of validating this information that we've collected. So in improving the atlas, one of the functionality would be a feedback, a platform where users can review the information that we are putting out there, and also giving them a platform to ask each other questions, and that provides some sort of cross referencing in information on the various technologies. And being within a university as well, and trying to contribute to the work, we've sort of have collaborative relationship with miners on the ground, which we are um bringing to interact with, for example, a science council that we're working with, Mintech, that does a lot of work on technology development. So we are hoping to test some of the technologies that they are using, and collect data from that end.
Thank you, Ponto. So, may I turn to Bill?
I'll actually keep my comments focused on the health side. And what I will say is, in terms of data uncertainty, I'm a statistician, so I worry about uncertainty all the time. But besides Mercury, the other work I do is on national surveillance systems, specifically with vector-borne diseases. And what I can tell you is that in terms of what we are asking countries to do, which is to conduct regular monitoring of mercury exposure in people. The infrastructure exists in most countries around the world to do this already. I would say that some of the technology that's required for testing mercury doesn't always exist. But let's not forget, we just came out of a pandemic where we quickly scaled up the ability for health systems to test for COVID, which is not an easy thing to do. Um, and I think that the investment needed to provide health systems the ability to monitor mercury in human populations is not a big investment, and it's something that many countries can already pull off. It just requires some political commitment, and that will really reduce the uncertainty in terms of monitoring who's exposed. The other question Dominique had, and I'll get to it if you want me to, but it's linking the source of mercury to ASGM and kind of looking at that causality. That's another thing to talk about, but I'll just stop there about the uncertainty piece.
Thanks, Bill. Alex?
Thank you. I agree with everything that's been said, so I'll try to say two separate things. First, on the data collection, I do think it's a kind of an interesting question. Where do we think most of the change in mercury use will come? Sites of specific interventions or general trends over a country landscape because of economic development? I actually think either could be going on, and the data collection is quite different, and we face different uncertainties, and we want to probably keep that in mind. I think I know about projects which are aiming at realities that are going away because of economic development. So even to design your intervention, you want to be able to track what's going on already because of the pace of normal economic change. Then you asked specifically, Dominique, about the coexistence and trust. I completely agree with that. In fact, one of the interesting things is UNDP Ecuador was going to fund a lab for doing tests so that people could agree on what they are transferring. And I think we have seen that individual miners don't want to aggregate because each one thinks they're a better miner, so they have higher quality output. And then you get into the question of how expensive is a test and how much quantity do you need for a test to be worthwhile, which is really important for ASGM. So I think those questions are all great. I will also say, though, that there are already transactions going on. We do have people bringing their ore to plants. We have people organizing, going out and competing essentially in an ore market to buy from small scale and medium scale folks. So we do see both realities: frozen non-transactions because of a lack of trust in testing, but also ongoing transactions. And I agree with you, we need to understand both. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Alex. If I may turn to the chat, there's some specific question about the data quality and so on, but I saw in very early in this session from Ram Charitra Sa how many developing countries party to MC have capacity of doing biomonitoring of mercury, and I think he refers to the human biomonitoring. I see, and perhaps I can refer to a recent WHO document about the human biomonitoring methodology, but perhaps I saw a colleague in the attendees list, the WHO colleague. Yeah, she's Irina. Do you wish to speak? I think you are unmuted, Irina. I think I can bring her.
Hello.
Hello, hello. I see you. I hear you.
You hear me? That's very good.
Yes. Yeah.
So actually, I cannot answer the question how many countries have capacities, but we have not very extensive, but valuable experience on the piloting of WHO standard operating procedure in at least 4 developing countries with low resources. And I completely agree with Bill that it is feasible. So it should be a decision at the high level to use the mercury HBM for exposure assessment. And in this case, not that big resources as, for example, for POPs are needed in order to evaluate exposure to mercury, either in general population or in ASGM. So again, it is feasible. We need to know countries that are interested in mercury HBM. We have methodological documents, standard operating procedure, and national survey protocol on 4 United Nations languages. And just to a couple of words on the Bill statements about health impact assessment. This is really very complex tasks because there are so many covariants like walking conditions, living condition, nutrition, education, and so on, so far. So there is also WHO publication, case study, for example, in Mozambique on health impact assessment. And if you will open it, it is around 15 different factors that can influence on the mercury impact, including mercury impact on human health. So thank you, Raisako. I hope that some information is provided. Yeah.
Thank you, Rina, and sorry for moving to the front suddenly. So
that's okay.
the panelists and participants, we have only two minutes, and I think I would propose turning to you, all the panelists, and invite you to make your last remark in 30 seconds. Perhaps in the order of the presentation, maybe Bill, Alex, Ponto, and Gosia, and then Dominique. Bill.
Sure. Thanks for the invitation for being on this panel, Isaku. I guess my final comment would just be to continue doing and working toward integrated research and integrated monitoring so that we look at the effectiveness of Minamata, not from just measuring one aspect of mercury emissions, but looking at the total impact of the policies being implemented. And I specifically, since I'm involved in health, I really would like the health component to be integrated in there in a more effective way.
Thanks, Bill. Alex?
Thank you. I'll build on Bill again. Thank you, Isaku, and everybody. Yeah, I'll just really what's in my presentation. It would be great with all the expertise and the policy interest and the potential funding if we can, as we do these things, require evidence, but also fund evidence so that people don't face a hard choice. And we can all learn from the things we are doing so we can do more of what works and less of what doesn't. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Then I think Ponto was first. Ponto.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation and the platform. On our side, we are continuing with the work that we are doing, looking at the various mercury-free technologies. So just inviting colleagues who are working in the space to connect with us so we can exchange information, and also an invite to colleagues to visit our digital atlas. I will leave the link in the chat box for them to provide feedback in terms of how we can improve the platform. Thank you.
Thanks. Gosha?
Thank you. So I just would like to highlight just one more time. Key lesson learned from my side is that to take into the consideration the numbers, but always look also into the narrative, qualitative data that is linked or is attached behind the numbers to better understand something, especially uncertainties. That's really important. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Dominic?
Thank you so much, Isaku, and I would like to thank all the panelists for all the information that they provided in the presentation and even for the answers that have been provided for the different questions. I am quite happy to know that we are all conscious of the uncertainties with the data and the challenges that countries are facing in developing even their project, but also to provide a clear picture of what the current situation of mercury coming from ASGM sector within their territories. But we think that based on that synergistic approach that we are having and to deal with different uncertainties in different countries, and even with the method that I use, we will be able to develop a comprehensive framework for the effectiveness evaluation. And we are sure that in the coming years, we'll see a significant reduction from mercury coming from ASGM sectors based on the intervention of data being done now, but also based on the refined methodologies that we use to even quantify mercury, and also based on how we intend to involve the social aspect and even the health communities, the healthcare providers in the different countries to even reduce the mercury use in ASGM sectors. So I think that so many have been said and have been done also. And I would like to thank you once again for attending this workshop and for inviting me also to be part of the panelists. Thank you so much, Isaku. Thank you to you.
Thank you, Dominic. I don't have many words, but thanks to all, and science is embedded in the convention. So we would look forward to further science policy intervention, not only on the ASGM but on the other aspects. The presentations with links will be posted on the website as well as the recording. So big thanks and have a nice rest of the day. Thank you very much.